A veteran had nothing left, until a stray dog saved him. This is the moving story of a war veteran who believed he had lost everything. Living on the streets, without hope or direction, he no longer saw a reason to keep going, until one unexpected encounter completely changed his life. A stray dog, as fragile as he was, brought back his courage, his dignity, and the strength to begin again. More than companions, the two became living proof that friendship can rescue even the most weary souls. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The cold at night seemed to cut through skin like thin blades. The streets were nearly empty, lit only by yellowed street lamps that cast long shadows on the damp asphalt. He walked slowly, worn-out boots barely carrying the weight of his exhausted body. His military coat, long stripped of its mothball smell and now carrying only dust and memories, was his only shield against the wind. Nobody looked at him. The few who passed by in a hurry turned their gaze away, as if the man with slouched shoulders, unshaven beard, and eyes that had seen too much wasn't even there. To the world, he was just another homeless figure occupying unwanted space on the sidewalk. To himself, he was still the soldier who once believed he was fighting for something greater, but who now couldn't find meaning even in the next step. The silence around him mocked the noise that still echoed in his mind gunfire. Explosions, screams that hadn't stopped in years. He had a name, but no one had spoken it in a long time. On his papers, it read Michael Turner, but on the streets, he was only the veteran, the guy in the green coat, or the one who talks to himself. His identity faded along with his dignity. His face carried more than wrinkles. Every line was a piece of a story no one cared to hear. In his pocket, he carried a bundle of crumpled papers, letters he never had the courage to send home. Shame weighed heavier than longing. How could he explain that the hero they expected had come back only as a broken man? Nights without shelter were a punishment he imposed on himself for not returning whole. He believed he deserved the cold ground, the contemptuous stares, the oblivion. And still, his body kept moving, one foot after the other, as if the discipline drilled into him during years of service was the only thread keeping him upright. His stomach growled, the sound of hunger no longer surprising. In his pockets were only a few dirty coins, maybe enough for a cheap cup of coffee at an all-night diner. But he knew spending on food tonight could mean having nothing tomorrow. He had learned to ration not only meals, but hope itself. That night, he thought about finding cover under an awning near the station. The wind there was weaker, and with luck he might find cardboard boxes to make a bed. But his body felt more exhausted than usual. His legs shook, and the invisible weight on his chest made breathing difficult. Doctors called it syndrome, post-war trauma. He called it an unending nightmare. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back on the battlefield. That's why he slept little, always alert, as if he were still on the front lines. People didn't see the man who once carried wounded comrades in his arms, who marched through deserts under a blazing sun, who wrote letters of encouragement to younger soldiers. They saw only the unsteady walk, the ragged clothes, the unkempt beard. To them, it looked like laziness, weakness, failure. He heard their judgments whispered as he passed. Another one who wasted his life, probably lost to drugs. Nobody asked. Nobody wanted to know. Invisibility hurt more than hunger. It was as if he no longer existed for the world outside. The glow of shop signs reflected in his tired eyes, reminding him that an entire city kept moving forward without him. The clock in the square struck midnight, but time meant nothing to him. Days blended together. Nights dragged on endlessly. The future didn't exist. Even in that colorless routine, he held on to small rituals that kept him human. He always carried a dented medal, a gift from a comrade who never came back. Every night, before lying down wherever he could, he closed his hand around it and whispered a silent thank you. He wasn't sure to whom God, fate, or the friend himself, but it was all he had left of faith. The medal was also a reminder that once his life had purpose, that someone trusted him until the end. Even when nothing seemed to matter, he held the cold medal and remembered a phrase from the army: "We don't leave anyone behind." The irony was bitter, because now it felt like the entire world had left him behind. The rain began lightly, almost as a warning. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, trying to shield the medal and the bundle of letters in his pocket. His body was used to the wet chill, but his spirit seemed less prepared with each passing day. Still, something in him kept walking, even without direction. Maybe it was just instinct. Maybe it was the last trace of an old desire for redemption. The sound of rain mixed with the distant echo of memories that refused to fade. The veteran moved through the streets like a man carrying an invisible cross, not knowing that on that very night, at a forgotten corner, he would find someone just as lost as himself. Someone who would forever change the course of his story. A stray dog, as wounded and lonely as the man wandering without a destination. The rain grew heavier quickly, turning the sidewalk into a dirty mirror where streetlights and distant shop windows shattered into trembling reflections. Michael quickened his pace, searching for a corner that could shield him from the damp cold already seeping through his coat. As he turned down a quieter street, he caught a muffled sound, almost like a faint cry, coming from near a dumpster. At first, he thought it was just another echo of the city, but the sound came again, weak, insistent. Curiosity pulled him closer. When he moved aside a piece of soaked cardboard, he saw a medium-sized dog, skin and bones, its fur matted with mud and dried blood. The animal trembled so violently, it looked as if each breath might tear it apart. Yet the eyes staring back at him weren't filled with fury or threat. They were eyes of fear and pain, begging for something he knew too well: survival. Michael's first instinct was to step back. Not because he was afraid of the dog, but because he felt he had nothing to give. He could barely take care of himself. How could he help another creature? But when the animal tried to curl in tighter, letting out a whimper that sounded almost human, something inside him cracked. Memories of fallen comrades on the battlefield, men he tried to carry until their very last breath, shot through his mind like lightning. He couldn't just turn his back. Slowly, he knelt, his knee pressing against the wet pavement, and reached out with caution. The dog gave a weak growl but didn't move forward. Michael pulled from his pocket a crumpled wrapper with half of a stale sandwich, saved for emergencies, and placed it on the ground, pushing it gently toward the animal. The trembling muzzle stretched forward, hesitant, until thin teeth tore into the bread. Watching the dog devour the food as if it were its first meal in days stirred something unfamiliar in Michael. He himself was starving, yet giving away that bit of food didn't feel like a sacrifice. It was almost a relief, as though handing it over restored some meaning to his existence. He studied every movement with intent, as if he were witnessing a small miracle unfold. The initial growl faded into frantic chewing, then into eyes that, for a fleeting second, lifted to meet his. In them was no longer only fear, but a flicker of trust. Michael's heart, long trained to beat only from the instinct to survive, thumped differently. For the first time in what felt like ages, he wasn't entirely alone that night. The rain kept falling, washing the ground and rinsing the dog's fur as it tried to crawl out of its corner. Michael extended his hand again, though he didn't force contact. He let the animal choose, respecting the distance that fear still demanded. The dog limped forward, its back leg dragging, and stopped right in front of him. Its gaze seemed to ask if trust was possible. Michael pulled from his pocket the rag he used as a handkerchief and gently dabbed some of the water from its back. The dog closed its eyes briefly, surrendering to the touch. That simple act of care was more powerful than any words. Michael breathed deeply, sensing a strange peace that didn't come from the city or the silence, but from the presence of this creature that, like him, had been forgotten by the world. They remained like that for several minutes. The wind whipped, the night crept on, yet neither seemed willing to leave. At last Michael stood, his joints stiff from fatigue, and looked around. He needed to find someplace dry for them both. The dog, still trembling, tried to follow but stumbled, collapsing onto its side. Michael bent down again, lifted the animal into his arms, and was struck by how light it was, almost nothing but skin and bones. For an instant, the image dragged him back to the trenches, carrying wounded comrades, desperate to save them from inevitable fates. But now, on this deserted street, he had the chance to do something different. The dog nestled its muzzle against his chest, as though surrendering to being carried. Michael closed his eyes and tightened his grip on the fragile body. As he walked, the dog cradled to his chest. Michael felt something he hadn't in years, a responsibility that came with purpose. Each step along the rain-soaked pavement no longer felt like a hollow act of survival, but a silent vow to this creature that had trusted him without asking for anything in return. The city still hurried past, indifferent, its lights flickering and cars rushing by in the distance. But within the small circle they formed together, there was a universe of two survivors. Michael knew he had nothing to offer in comfort, in future, in certainty. And yet, in that moment, he had something he thought he had lost forever: the ability to care. Even if it lasted only a single night, it would be the start of a new journey, not alone anymore, but alongside a dog that also needed saving. The rain began lightly, almost as a warning. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, trying to shield the metal and the bundle of letters in his pocket. His body was used to the wet chill, but his spirit seemed less prepared with each passing day. Still, something in him kept walking, even without direction. Maybe it was just instinct. Maybe it was the last trace of an old desire for redemption. The sound of rain mixed with the distant echo of memories that refused to fade. The veteran moved through the streets like a man carrying an invisible cross, not knowing that on that very night, at a forgotten corner, he would find someone just as lost as himself. Someone who would forever change the course of his story. A stray dog, as wounded and lonely as the man wandering without a destination. Dawn arrived slowly, painting the sky a pale gray, and found Michael curled beneath an awning with Sam lying across his lap. The dog's body still trembled, but the panic of the previous night had eased. Michael had stayed awake for hours, listening to every breath, sharing with him the warmth of his worn coat and the scraps of cardboard that kept them off the damp ground. He knew about the city's night shelters, places where he could sleep in a narrow bed and get a hot meal, but he rarely allowed himself to go. He felt unworthy of that kind of relief, as though being alive was already more than he deserved. He always believed there was someone worse off, someone who needed that spot more than he did. And beyond that, animals weren't allowed. And the idea of leaving Sam behind on the street, even for one night, was unbearable. Still seated, he watched the first commuters cross the sidewalk on their way to work. Some averted their eyes. Others lingered for a second, intrigued by the sight of a ragged man holding a dog just as fragile as himself. For the first time in years, Michael didn't feel completely invisible. The dog seemed to draw the attention he had never managed to earn on his own. That stirred a mix of shame and pride. Shame for the state he was in, but pride because, somehow, he was still capable of protecting a life. With the morning light, he decided to give his companion a name. After a moment of silence, he whispered, "Sam," remembering a fellow soldier who always had a word of encouragement. At the sound, the dog perked its ears and, even weak, wagged its tail. For Michael, that small gesture was confirmation. Sam had accepted the bond. The days that followed brought a different routine. Michael no longer walked the streets alone. Wherever he went, Sam followed, limping but determined. Together, they shared scraps of food scavenged from bins, water in reused bottles, and the same corners beneath bridges or shop doors. Michael noticed that with the dog by his side, the city's hostility was easier to face. Children came closer to pet Sam, and parents who once seemed wary now stopped to chat for a moment. Some women offered pieces of meat, and young people left coins beside the blanket. Michael always hesitated, but accepted for Sam's sake. It was easier to receive help when it wasn't only about him. On an especially cold afternoon, Michael was persuaded to try the shelter on Main Street. He carried the same resistance as always, the heavy belief that he didn't deserve a bed. But Sam was weak, stumbling as he walked, and that gave Michael the courage to try. When they arrived, the line had already formed. The worker handing out tickets cast a doubtful glance at the dog, aware of the rules against animals. Michael braced himself to turn back, but the man studied them closely. He saw the veteran's arm wrapped firmly around the dog, and the way Sam rested his head on Michael's chest, as if it were the only safe place in the world. Breaking the rule, the man sighed and said, "Tonight, both of you go in. Looks like you need it more than most here." The feeling of walking through those doors with Sam at his side was strange. Michael couldn't remember the last time he had slept under a roof. The shelter was simple, rows of narrow beds and the smell of soup in the air. But to him, it felt like a palace. He laid Sam down in a corner with a thin blanket, making a bed as dignified as possible for the dog. Watching the animal fall asleep within minutes, breathing more steadily, sent a wave of relief through him. For the first time in years, Michael felt he didn't have to fight the night alone. There were no gunshots, no trenches, only the warmth of a presence reminding him there were still reasons to hold on. That night, sleep came differently. The nightmares were still there, but the weight wasn't the same. Sam was alive, breathing, and that was enough. The veteran realized he could no longer go back to the old logic of surrendering to invisibility and neglect. Caring for the dog gave him a mission again. It didn't matter that it was small or that no one else would recognize it. For him, it meant everything. Two survivors had found each other at the lowest point in life, and together they were discovering that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way forward. The morning arrived with sounds different from those Michael was used to on the streets. Instead of hurried cars or the biting wind, he heard shuffling footsteps in the hallway, utensils clattering against plastic plates, and the low hum of tired voices. He opened his eyes slowly, feeling the stiffness of the narrow bed, yet realizing his body had rested in a way it hadn't for years. Beside him, Sam stretched out, wagging his tail even with eyes still closed, as if he too had discovered that peace was possible in sleep. Michael watched the dog for a few seconds, holding on to that fragile sense of normalcy. When he stood up, he noticed curious glances. Some men frowned, others smiled faintly, surprised to see a dog inside. No one complained. It was as if everyone silently understood that this animal had just as much right to rest as they did Dot in the breakfast line. Michael kept his usual guarded posture, holding the tray like a shield, avoiding eye contact. But he couldn't stop a small boy, sitting beside his mother, from asking to pet Sam. The dog, still timid, leaned forward slowly and accepted the touch with a soft sigh. The woman smiled at Michael and said simply, "He looks happy with you." Just a few words, but they struck deeply. It had been years since anyone credited him with anything good. That simple phrase planted a seed of recognition that began to crack the wall of invisibility around him. Eating warm soup and stale bread, sharing crumbs with Sam, no longer felt humiliating but communal. For Michael, it was as if he had been invited back to a table, however improvised. After years of exile, as days passed, Sam's presence drew small acts of generosity. A volunteer brought a bag of cheap dog food, handing it straight to Michael and asking him to take good care of his companion. Another, a retired nurse, noticed the dog's injured paws and offered healing ointments, showing him how to apply them. Embarrassed, Michael accepted because he knew Sam needed it. Caring for the dog became part of his daily routine, cleaning wounds, feeding him, stroking his fur. Around him, other residents of the shelter watched in silence, some whispering that the hardened man from the streets had gentle hands when it came to the animal. For Michael, each small act of care awakened memories of carrying wounded comrades from the battlefield. There was no blood here, no gunfire, but the same responsibility pulsed through him, returning a fragment of the identity he thought lost. On the third morning, when he stepped outside for a short walk around the block with Sam, an unexpected encounter shifted his routine. An elderly woman selling fruit from a wooden stand noticed the dog limping and asked his name. Michael answered softly, and she handed him an apple with a few coins. "You two remind me there's still kindness," she said casually. Michael froze, holding the apple as if it were too precious to accept. He murmured a barely audible thank you, but the moment lingered all day. For the first time in years, someone had looked at him without judgment or disdain, seeing value in his presence. Sharing the apple with Sam tasted like dignity, stronger than any banquet. As days rolled on, Michael's relationship with Sam and the community around the shelter grew. Children lit up at the sight of the dog, some stopping to play, and that created openings for small conversations with parents and passers-by. In those moments, Michael discovered he could sustain dialogue without feeling like an intruder. Ordinary people offered small jobs, carrying boxes at the market, painting a fence, helping move furniture. Simple tasks, but they brought a few coins and, more importantly, the sense of usefulness. Each job completed was not just a victory over hunger, but a pushback against the stigma that had marked him. He was no longer just the lost man, but the man with the loyal dog. That change in how others saw him began to change how he saw himself. One evening, returning tired from one of those odd jobs, a volunteer from the shelter approached him and spoke about the importance of restoring his documents. "Without them, you'll always find the same closed doors," the man said with quiet honesty. Michael laughed nervously, trying to mask the discomfort. For him, documents meant a life he no longer believed existed. But that night, lying down with Sam curled against his chest, he thought about those words. He remembered the wrinkled envelope he had guarded for years, filled with an old ID and letters never sent. The idea of putting his life back in order no longer seemed impossible. He looked at Sam and whispered, "If you believe in me, maybe I can start believing too." In that moment, he realized the doors weren't only opening around him, they were beginning to open within him. Life at the shelter had just begun to feel steady when Michael noticed something was wrong with Sam. The dog, once livelier and eager, now spent long hours lying down, breathing with difficulty. His tail wagged less, his eyes seemed heavy, and the food he was given no longer sparked the same hunger. Michael recognized the signs, not because he was an expert with animals, but because he knew the look of someone fighting against a body too tired to keep going. Fear swelled inside him like an invisible enemy. Since Sam had entered his life, every step forward had been anchored by the dog's presence. The thought of losing him reopened a wound Michael thought he had buried, the terror of being powerless to save those he loved. That morning, instead of looking for odd jobs or wandering the streets, Michael carried Sam in his arms to a small community veterinary clinic that had opened just 3 blocks from the shelter. The dog trembled, and the heat radiating from his body was unmistakable fever. Michael walked in, unsure of how he would be received. All eyes turned toward him, a disheveled man holding a sick dog. He approached the counter, explaining in a low voice what was happening. The receptionist hesitated, asking for information he didn't have. But when she caught the desperation in his eyes, she called a veterinarian. Michael stood there, clutching Sam as if that grip was the last thread holding hope together. The veterinarian examined Sam carefully, checking his temperature, inspecting the sores on his paws, and listening to his rapid heartbeat. He explained that the dog had an infection that could turn dangerous quickly without treatment. Michael listened with a knot in his throat. Already fearing the answer to the question, he forced himself to ask how much it would cost. The number was far beyond the coins in his pocket. For a moment he thought of walking out, but the dog's gaze held him, pleading silently not to give up. Drawing a deep breath, Michael told the doctor he would do anything, work however long it took, but he couldn't let Sam die. The vet studied him for a few moments before agreeing to try an arrangement, using donated medicine and help from a volunteer network. As they waited, Michael sat in the reception area with Sam lying across his lap, hooked up to an IV line. The dog's breathing grew steadier, and the relief was overwhelming, though the weight of responsibility remained. Memories of the battlefield flooded back. Comrades he couldn't save, promises broken in the chaos of war, voices that fell silent forever. Now, with Sam, he had a chance to rewrite part of that story. He couldn't fail again. The dog wasn't just an animal. He was the reason Michael woke up every morning, the anchor that kept him from sinking completely. Stroking Sam's coarse fur, Michael whispered softly, not to calm the dog, but to steady himself. The following days were filled with trips back and forth to the clinic. Michael took on small jobs offered by people connected to the shelter, hauling trash bags, cleaning storage spaces, painting fences. Every cent was tucked away carefully and handed over in small amounts to cover Sam's treatment. The work was grueling, but the sense of purpose was greater. Each time he saw Sam improve, his tail flicking again, his thirst returning, Michael felt every drop of sweat had been worth it. The clinic's volunteers began to recognize him not as a man adrift, but as someone determined, responsible, and unrelenting in his care. That shift in how they looked at him changed something inside. For the first time, he wasn't just receiving help, he was actively fighting for someone else's life. When the veterinarian finally announced that Sam was out of danger, Michael almost broke down in tears. He thanked him again and again, pressing Sam against his chest as though he could shield him from all harm. They left the clinic together, walking slowly back toward the shelter, the late afternoon sun glistening on the rain-washed pavement. Michael knew there was still a long road ahead, but something inside him had shifted. The fear of losing Sam had forced him to confront not just illness, but also the ghosts of his past. He realized that, even broken, he still carried enough courage to fight. And that courage, born from the simple act of caring for an abandoned dog, was proof that life still waited for him beyond the pain. The weeks at the shelter brought some relief, but Michael knew he couldn't stay there forever. The place was important. It offered a bed and soup, but it was only a stopgap. Deep inside, the desire to truly rebuild his life grew stronger, to give Sam a stable home. The dog had survived abandonment and illness, and now ran through the halls with renewed energy, drawing smiles from everyone. That contrast only sharpened Michael's conviction. He no longer wanted to live depending on the kindness of others. He needed to prove to himself that he was capable of building something solid. His bond with Sam wasn't just companionship, it was fuel. He felt that if he didn't take the next step, he would be betraying the silent vow he had made the night he first held that dog in his arms. The opportunity came when a volunteer mentioned a building maintenance company looking for someone reliable for steady work. Michael, hesitant, nearly refused, convinced no one would hire a man with his appearance and tangled past. But he was persuaded to try, and he showed up for the interview wearing clean clothes donated at the shelter. The owner, after hearing his story, decided to take a chance, impressed by his discipline and by the way he spoke about Sam. "Man who takes care of an animal like that won't abandon his work," he said firmly. Receiving the blue uniform and signing the contract were quiet victories. There was no applause, but inside, Michael felt he had regained something long lost: dignity. With his first paycheck, Michael made a decision that filled him with pride. He rented a small room in a cheap boarding house where pets were allowed. The space was nothing more than 4 narrow walls, a small window, and a single bed, but for him and Sam, it was a palace. He prepared it with care: an improvised box with a blanket for the dog, and on a nail in the wall, he hung the envelope with his documents, a symbol that he finally had a real address. That first night outside the shelter, he lay down listening to Sam's calm breathing and realized he was no longer afraid of the future. Life was still hard, but now there was a roof, a routine, and the warmth of the friendship that sustained him. At work, Michael's colleagues found him overly serious at first, but soon noticed his dedication. He arrived early, carried out every task with rigor, and rarely complained. Sam escorted him to the door every morning, wagging his tail as if he understood the importance of those departures. Little by little, they became known in the neighborhood. The local grocery set aside bones for the dog, and the baker offered Michael a hot coffee on cold mornings. These weren't just small gestures. They were signs that he was once again part of a community. He was no longer seen as the invisible man from the streets, but as someone who had overcome darkness with perseverance and care. Months later came the biggest surprise. A nearby school invited him to speak to students about courage and resilience. Michael thought of refusing, dreading the weight of such exposure, but he took Sam along and spoke simply. He didn't just describe war. He spoke of abandonment, of the cold streets, and of the night everything changed when he met the dog. He told them how that unexpected bond gave him responsibility again and made him believe it was still possible to begin anew. When he finished, the children applauded and rushed to pet Sam, who welcomed them with joy. Moved, Michael understood he was no longer just surviving. Now, he was inspiring others not to give up. That night, back in his small room, Michael looked around the cramped space and smiled. Sam was already asleep, curled up on his blanket as if he knew it was their home. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Michael ran a hand along the dog's collar and whispered, "We did it. There was no wealth, no great material achievement, but there was peace, purpose, and dignity." Two survivors who had met at rock bottom had climbed together, step by step, to a place where they were no longer defined by the past, but by the courage to keep going. The veteran who once believed he deserved nothing now had what mattered most: a loyal friend, a safe roof, and the certainty that he would never face life alone again. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.